The wind in Wind River Crossing had teeth, and it never stopped biting. It was a high plains wind, born in the mountains and dying nowhere, and it screamed across the treeless flats of Wyoming with a bitter, personal spite. It was the first thing Clara heard in the morning, a high-pitched keen through the warped boards of her shack, and the last thing she heard at night, a low, threatening growl that shook the flimsy door. The shack itself was a kindness that felt like a curse. It leaned against the soot-stained back wall of the blacksmith's shop, more of a woodpile than a home. Mr. Gable, the smithy, had let her have it. His way of settling a debt with her dead husband. Silas, and clearing his own conscience. The rent was paid in silence. She was to be invisible. She was to not bother his customers. Invisibility was a price Clara was forced to pay. She was 32 years old, but looked a decade older, worn smooth and gray as river stone. Her life was a litany of harsh substances. Lye soap that cracked her hands raw, scalding water that steamed her face until it was numb, and the sour smell of spilled whiskey and stale tobacco that clung to her clothes from sweeping out the Golden Nugget Saloon before dawn. She washed clothes for the men at the boarding house, and she swept floors. For this, she earned enough to buy flour, sometimes beans, never meat. Her children were the only color left in her world, and they too were fading. Henry was 8. He had his father's dark eyes, but they were clouded now with a fever that never quite broke. He had a cough, a dry, racking bark that seemed to tear at his thin chest. He spent most days on their one cot, a straw-stuffed mattress that stank of mold, wrapped in every piece of cloth Clara owned. Ruthie was 5. She was barefoot. Her last pair of shoes had given up 3 months ago, and she'd worn them until her toes pushed through the leather. Now, the soles of her feet were cracked and black, tough as buffalo hide. She was small for her age, a bundle of twigs in a thin dress, but her eyes were sharp. She was the watcher. She was the one who saw the hunger in her mother's face and the pain in her brother's. And she had forgotten how to cry. The people of Wind River Crossing avoided them all. They did not just look away. They actively recoiled. Clara was a bad omen. She was the widow of Silas, the man who had been foolish enough to file a claim on land the North Plains Cattle Syndicate wanted. He had believed in the law. In the paperwork he'd filed in Cheyenne, the syndicate believed in rifles and hired men. Silas had been found dead in a gulch, his body broken. The sheriff had ruled it a riding accident. The syndicate's lawyer, a man with a tidy mustache and dead eyes, had filed a counterclaim on the land 2 days later, when Clara, mad with grief, had tried to fight it, to stand in the courthouse and scream the word murder. The town had turned on her. She had brought trouble. She had defied the syndicate, the engine that fed the town. She was, therefore, bad luck. The women crossed the street when they saw her. The men looked through her. The preacher spoke of the wages of vanity from his pulpit. The curse was as real as the cold. It meant no decent work. It meant no credit at the general store. It meant that Mr. Holloway, the butcher, could look at her with open contempt. This afternoon, the wind was driving pellets of sleet that stung her cheeks. Henry had been coughing all night, a terrible, wet sound that terrified her. He needed broth. He needed something, anything, with strength in it. Clara stood outside Holloway's butcher shop for a long time. The warmth and the rich, iron smell of fresh meat wafted out every time the door opened. She could see the sawdust on the floor, the clean white aprons, the magnificent ribs of beef hanging from hooks. Ruthie shivered beside her, her small hand tight in Clara's skirt. "Wait here, Ruthie. Stay right by the wall." "I'm cold, Mama." "I know. I'll be quick." Clara pushed the door open. The bell above it jangled, a cheerful sound that was a lie. Mr. Holloway was at his block, a heavy cleaver in his hand. He looked up, and his face, usually ruddy and bland, hardened. "We ain't buying, Clara." "I'm not selling, Mr. Holloway?" Her voice was a low rasp. She hated this. She hated the bowing of her head, the shame that burned in her stomach. I was wondering if you had any scraps, just trimmings, for a soup, my boy, Henry, he's poorly." Holloway finished splitting a bone with a wet thwack. He wiped his hands on his apron, leaving a streak of red. "This is a place of business. I don't run a charity. Please, anything, things you'd throw to the dogs, I can pay. I'll have money on Friday." "Your money ain't good here," he said, and it was the simple, flat truth. He turned his back to her. "I've got nothing for you, not for your kind. Now get out, you're bothering the customers." A woman in a fine wool coat, Mrs. Abernathy, had just entered. She looked at Clara, at her cracked hands and desperate eyes, and sniffed, turning pointedly to inspect a row of chickens. The shame was a physical blow. Clara backed out of the shop, the bell mocking her departure. The cold hit her, and the sleet. Ruthie looked up, her small face pinched with a question Clara could not bear to answer. He didn't have anything left. Baby, it's all right. We'll go home." Home was the shack, and home had no food. Clara's shoulders slumped. The fight was gone. She led Ruthie not to the shack, but to the alley that ran between the blacksmith and the Golden Nugget Saloon. It was out of the main wind. At least, the saloon's kitchen door was here. And sometimes the cook, a man named Shorty, would leave a bucket of scraps for the town dogs. The bucket was there. It was nearly empty, mostly potato peelings and coffee grounds. But at the bottom, there was a half-eaten loaf of bread, soggy with grease, and a few pieces of gristle with meat still clinging to them. Clara's stomach turned. She had never, not ever, stooped this low, but she heard Henry's cough in her mind. She sat on the frozen mud, pulling Ruthie into her lap to share her body heat. She picked the scraps from the bucket with numb fingers. She wiped the coffee grounds off the bread and broke it. "Here, baby, eat." Ruthie ate. She ate with a desperate, animal quickness that broke her mother's heart. Clara ate a piece of the bread herself, the taste of ash and spoiled fat in her mouth. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she just wanted to die. She wanted to lie down in the mud and let the wind take her. Elias saw them from across the street. He had just come from the general store, his saddlebags heavy with a 50-pound sack of flour, cartridges for his rifle, salt, and a small tin of coffee. He was a tall man, built of long, quiet muscle. His face was hidden by a low-brimmed hat, stained and worn, and a rough beard. A scar, white and thin, ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw. He worked at the Bar Z, an outlying ranch, and kept to himself. He rode into town once a month, got his supplies, and rode out. He spoke to no one. The town, in turn, left him be. He was untying the reins of his bay when he saw the woman and the 2 children huddled in the alley. He recognized Clara. Everyone knew her story. He, like the rest, had always looked away. It was not his trouble. He had enough trouble of his own. A cold, hard knot of it he'd carried for 6 years. Ever since the fever took his wife and son back in Texas. He'd come to Wyoming to get away from the memory. But the emptiness had just followed him, vast and cold as the land itself. He stopped, his hand on the horse's neck. He watched. The sleet was turning to snow, wet and heavy. The little girl, Ruthie, was shivering so hard her shoulders shook. The boy, Henry, was leaning against his mother, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Clara was rubbing his hands, her own face a mask of dull misery. Then Elias saw the small, terrible scene that changed everything. Clara broke the last piece of greasy bread in 2. She gave the larger piece to Henry, who took it without opening his eyes. She held the smaller piece, no bigger than her thumb, and looked at it. She was about to put it in her own mouth when Ruthie made a small, hungry sound. Clara's hand stopped. She looked at her daughter's pinched face. She looked at the bread, and then she held it out to the girl. Ruthie shook her head. "You, Mama." "No, you eat." The girl, Ruthie, took the bread. She looked at it. Then she looked at her brother, who had started to cough. That dry, hacking bark. The girl didn't hesitate. She crawled over and pushed the last dirty bite of bread into Henry's hand. "You eat it, Henry," she whispered, her voice so thin the wind almost stole it. "You gotta get strong." Elias did not move. He could not. The wind howled, but he heard the whisper. He felt it. It was like a fist reaching into his chest and squeezing the cold knot of his own grief until it cracked. He remembered his own son, a fat, laughing baby. He remembered his wife, Maria, humming by the fire. The ice that had protected him for 6 years shattered. He felt a sudden, sharp, and agonizing thaw. It was a pain so deep he almost grunted with it. He did not think, he just acted. His boots made no sound in the mud as he crossed the street. Clara heard the scrape of a boot on stone and her head snapped up. A man was standing there, a tall shadow against the swirling gray snow. She could not see his face, just the dark shape of him, broad-shouldered and still. She scrambled to her feet, shoving both children behind her skirt. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a cornered animal. Shame was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate ferocity. "Leave us be," she spat, her voice hoarse. She expected him to laugh. She expected him to mock her, to call her trash eater. Or worse, she expected a proposition. He was a cowboy, and she was a desperate woman in an alley. The man did not laugh. He did not move. He just stood there, maybe 10 feet away, looking at her. He seemed to be looking through her, at the shack behind her, at the empty, frozen world she inhabited. He finally moved, taking 1 step closer. He pushed his hat back just enough for her to see his eyes. They were not cruel. They were not kind. They were just set, as if he had been looking at a long, hard trail and had finally decided which way to go. His voice was low, rough from disuse, like a rusty hinge. It was not gentle. It was not mean. It was flat. It was a statement of fact. "Get your things," he said. "You're coming home." Clara stared at him. The words made no sense. They were from a different world. "What? What did you say?" "Get your things," he repeated, just as flatly. A cold, hysterical bubble of laughter rose in her throat. He was mocking her. It was a joke, a new and spectacular kind of cruelty she had not yet experienced. "You think you're funny, mister? You think this is a game?" Her voice cracked. "Please, we don't have nothing to steal. We ain't. Just go on. Get your laugh and go." Elias looked at her, at the fierce, terrified pride in her eyes. He looked at the 2 small children peering around her skirt. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply turned and looked at the broken-down shack behind the blacksmith's. "Those your things in there?" He started walking toward it. Clara panicked. "No! Stay away from there! You can't!" He did not stop. He reached the flimsy door and pushed it open. It scraped on the frozen ground. He looked inside. He saw the single, filthy cot. He saw the small, cold hearth, black with old ashes. He saw the bucket in the corner that served as their wash basin. He saw the utter, complete, and final emptiness of the place. He turned back to her. The storm swirled around him. He was a solid, unmoving thing. "Get them!" It was a command, and it was not a joke. Clara was frozen. She did not understand. This man was a stranger. Why was he doing this? What did he want? Her mind raced through all the terrible possibilities. Ruthie, terrified by the strange man and her mother's fear, tried to run to Clara. Her bare foot slipped on a patch of icy mud, and she went down hard, a sharp, breathless cry. Before Clara could even take a step, Elias was there. He moved with a speed that was shocking. In one motion, he bent and scooped the little girl up. He held her against his chest, cradling her head. She was so light, she was no more than a bundle of rags in his arm. Ruthie was too shocked to cry. She just stared at the man's scarred cheek, her small, cold hand gripping the front of his wool coat. Elias looked at Clara, who was gaping at him. He was holding her daughter. "Get Henry," he said, and his voice was a fraction softer now. "And the blankets. Whatever else you need. We're leaving." That was what broke her. The act. He had not hurt Ruthie. He held her as a father would. He was not laughing. He was waiting. Clara moved like a woman in a dream, her limbs heavy and disconnected. She ran to the shack, her mind a roaring blank. She grabbed Henry by the arm. "Get up! Henry, we have to go!" "Where? Mama, it's cold." "I know. Just come now." She pulled him to his feet. He was weak, dizzy, leaning on her. She grabbed the one threadbare quilt from the bed. She snatched a small, carved wooden box from the floor, the only thing she had left of Silas, containing his picture and their wedding certificate. She had nothing else. No other clothes. No other food. Nothing. She stumbled back out into the alley. Elias had not moved. He stood like a statue, holding Ruthie, who had, impossibly, buried her face in the warm, dry wool of his coat. She smelled pine and horse and man, a scent that was not the sour smell of the saloon. "My horse is at the general store," Elias said. He turned and began to walk. He did not look back to see if she was following. He just assumed she would. And she did. Clara, holding Henry's hand, half dragging him, followed the tall stranger through the main street of Wind River Crossing. The town saw them. "Mrs. Abernathy, just leaving the butcher shop, stopped dead, her mouth falling open." Two men outside the saloon stopped talking, their cigarettes forgotten. Mr. Gable, the blacksmith, came to the door of his shop, his hammer in his hand, and stared. They saw Elias, the silent man from the Bar Z. They saw him carrying the barefoot child of the cursed widow, and they saw Clara, filth on her dress, shame burning on her face, pulling her sick boy behind him. The whispers started before they had even passed. Clara felt their stares like stones, hot and sharp. She wanted to shrink. She wanted to run, but the man in front of her just kept walking, his back a solid wall, ignoring them all. He reached his horse, a big bay that shifted nervously in the wind, in one fluid motion. Elias mounted, settling Ruthie on the saddle in front of him, shielded by his body. He wrapped the edges of his long duster coat around her. He looked down at Clara and Henry. The snow was falling faster, thicker. "He can't walk it," Elias stated. It was not a question. He reached down his left hand, a large, calloused and scarred hand. "Up!" Clara hesitated. This was the final step. Getting on this horse, with this man, was an act she could not take back. She was leaving. She was abandoning the last piece of her old life. She was trusting a man she did not know, a man who had spoken maybe 20 words to her. Henry coughed, a deep, rattling sound that shook his whole body. Clara looked at her son. Then she looked at the hand. She took it. His grip was like iron. It did not gentle her, it hauled her. He pulled her and Henry up onto the horse's broad rump, settling them behind him. It was a tight, awkward, and improper fit. Clara was pressed against the hard muscle of his back, her arms around Henry, who was wedged between them. Elias reached behind him without looking and untied the oilcloth slicker from his saddle roll. He threw it back, covering her and the boy. "Hold on," he said. He clicked his tongue. The horse, eager to leave the town and the storm, moved forward. They walked past the last few buildings, past the silent, staring faces, and out onto the open plain. The wind hit them with the force of a physical blow. The world dissolved into a howling chaos of white and gray. Clara buried her face in Henry's hair. her arms locked around his small chest. She was terrified. This man could be a monster. He could be a madman taking them into the wilderness to kill them. He could be anything. But her son was coughing, and the man's back was a solid wall against the wind. Ruthie was quiet in his arms, finally warm, for the first time in a year. The wind was not cutting directly to Clara's bones. She could feel the heat of his body, even through his coat. She closed her eyes, the sleet stinging her face, and held on, beneath the raw, shrieking terror. A small, impossible, and traitorous flicker of safety had begun to burn. They were leaving. Whatever came next, they were leaving Wind River Crossing. The ride was a blur of freezing misery. Elias did not speak. He was a wall of wool and leather, angled against the storm, and the great horse underneath them moved with a steady, plodding rhythm. Clara clung to Henry, her body aching with the cold and the unnatural posture. She did not know how long they rode. The world was nothing but the shriek of the wind and the driving. Horizontal snow. The flat, open plain of the town gave way to a gentle, upward slope. The ground grew rockier. She could sense, more than see, the shapes of trees, dark pines that groaned under the weight of the wind. They were in the foothills. The air, impossibly, grew colder, but the wind was broken by the rising land and the timber. They were climbing. Henry did not make a sound, but his shivering was a constant, violent vibration against her. Ruthie was a still, small weight in the man's arms, her head tucked deep inside his coat. Clara prayed the girl was still breathing. After what felt like hours, Elias turned the horse sharply off the barely visible trail, pushing through a stand of thick lodgepole pines. A dark shape loomed ahead, a small, snow-drifted barn, and beyond it, a cabin. It was the most isolated place Clara had ever seen. No lights from any neighbors, no smoke from any other chimneys, just the wind, the trees, and the two low buildings squatting in the snow. Elias stopped the horse at the barn first. He dismounted, and for a horrible second, Clara thought he meant to leave them there, but he only reached up, his arms strong and sure, and took Ruthie from the saddle. The girl was asleep, her face pale and chilled, but her breath was a small, white puff in the air. He handed the child to Clara. "Take them inside. The door is not locked." He gestured to the cabin, then turned back to his horse, leading the exhausted animal into the barn's darkness. Clara, her legs numb and weak, slid from the horse's back, nearly collapsing into the snowdrift. She held Ruthie tight and pulled Henry by his coat. "Come on, Henry, just a little more." The cabin door scraped open on a wooden floor. She stumbled inside, into pitch blackness. It smelled of cold ash, pine, and cured leather. She stood in the center of the single room, shaking, blind, holding her two children. A moment later, the door opened again, and Elias entered. He carried his saddlebags, the sack of flour, and an armload of firewood from a covered pile by the door. He did not look at her. He went straight to the large, black, pot-bellied stove in the corner. He knelt, his back to her, and with quick, expert hands, he used his knife to shave tinder from a log. He struck a match, and the small flame illuminated his scarred face, casting deep, dancing shadows. The fire caught. A small, hungry orange light grew inside the stove. He added larger pieces, and the iron body of the stove began to radiate a weak, blessed heat. Only then did he light the coal oil lamp on the small table. The room was revealed. It was sparse, but it was not filthy. The floor was plank wood, swept clean. In one corner stood a narrow cot, a single gray blanket folded neatly upon it. In the other, the stove, a small table with two chairs. A few shelves on the wall held a tin plate, a cup, a skillet, and a small sack of what looked like coffee beans. There was no other bed. Elias unslung his saddlebags and dropped them on the floor. He opened the flour sack and the other supplies and set them on the table. "There is a kettle," he said, his voice low. He pointed to a hook by the stove. "Melt snow for water. The children should be on the cot." He looked at the narrow bed. He looked at Clara. His gaze was unreadable. He turned and walked back out the door, closing it quietly behind him. Clara stood frozen. She heard the sound of him moving in the barn, a soft thump of a saddle being removed, the murmur of his voice to the horse. He was not coming back. He was going to sleep in the barn, in the storm. She did not understand, but she was too tired to question it. She was in a room with a fire. She laid Henry on the cot and covered him with a gray blanket. He curled into a tight ball, his coughing already seeming to lessen in the growing warmth. She sat Ruthie on one of the chairs, where the girl watched the stove, her eyes wide. "Mama, it's warm." "I know, baby." Clara found the kettle. She went outside, scooped it full of clean, drifted snow, and set it on the stove. The quiet hiss as the first flakes hit the hot iron was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. When the water was warm, she poured it into the single tin basin on the shelf. She took a piece of her own petticoat and tore it. She knelt in front of Ruthie. "Let's get you clean," she whispered. She pulled the girl's stiff, dirty dress off. She dipped the rag in the hot water, the steam rising around her hands. She began to wash her daughter. She washed the layers of grime from her arms, her neck, her small, thin chest. She washed her face, revealing the pale skin beneath, and she washed her feet, the black, calloused, cracked feet of a child who had forgotten shoes, as she held that small, dirty foot in her hand, scrubbing gently. The reality of the last hour, the last 6 months, crashed down upon her. This man, this stranger, he had taken them from an alley where they were eating garbage. He had brought them to a warm room. He had given them his fire, his supplies, and his own bed, and had asked for nothing. He had not touched her. He had not spoken a cruel word. He had simply helped. A single hot tear fell from her eye and hissed on the floor. Then another. She ducked her head, her shoulders shaking, and wept. She cried silently, her body convulsing with the force of the grief and the relief and the terror. She cried for Silas. She cried for her children. And she cried for the simple, impossible act of kindness that she could not understand. Ruthie, feeling her mother's tears on her skin, put a small hand on Clara's cheek. "It's all right, Mama. We're warm." The next few days were a strange, silent dream. The storm blew itself out, leaving the world buried in a white, soundless ocean of snow. The cabin was a small, dark rock in the middle of it. Clara and the children did not leave. Elias came to the door 3 times a day. He would knock, a solid, heavy rap. He would not enter until she opened it. He would bring in firewood and a bucket of fresh snow for water. He would look at Henry on the cot. He would nod once, and he would leave. He slept in the barn. She knew this because she saw the smoke from the small chimney pipe on the barn's roof. He had a stove in there, too. He was giving them the house. Clara, desperate to do something, to not be a useless burden, made it her own. She used his flour and the water to make flat, tasteless biscuits, cooked in the skillet. She fed them to the children. She found a broom made of tied branches and swept the floor over and over. She found his spare shirt, stiff with sweat and dirt, and she washed it in the basin and hung it to dry by the fire. She mended a hole in Henry's trousers with thread pulled from the hem of her own skirt. She did not have much, but she could work. But Henry was not getting better. The warmth and the meager food were not enough. The fever, which had receded on the first night, returned with a vengeance. On the 3rd day, he was burning. He did not wake. He lay on the cot, his small body rigid, his breathing fast and shallow. He spoke, but not to them. He called for his father. He whispered about a dog they had once owned. He was delirious. Clara was frantic. She bathed his head with cold snow water, but the cloth would be hot in seconds. She tried to force water between his lips, but he choked. "He's burning up, Mama," Ruthie whispered from the chair, her small face pale with fear. "He'll be all right. He just needs to rest." But Clara knew it was a lie. She had seen this fever before. In the town. It took children. It was taking her son. When Elias knocked that afternoon, she flung the door open. Her face was a mask of terror. Elias took one look at her, then passed her to the cot. He saw the boy, the flush on his cheeks, the restless, twitching movement of his hands. He did not need to be told. Clara grabbed his arm. It was the first time she had touched him. His arm was like a frozen piece of timber. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "He's so hot, I don't know what to do. Is there a doctor? Is there anything?" Elias looked at the boy. His face, scarred and bearded, was impossible to read. But his eyes were dark with a pain she recognized. He looked at the boy as if he were looking at a ghost. He did not answer her. He pulled his arm gently from her grasp. He turned and walked away from the cabin, toward the barn. Clara's heart seized. He was leaving. He was walking away. The sickness was too much. The burden was too great. He was abandoning them, just like everyone else. "No!" she screamed, running out into the snow, heedless of the cold. "No, please, don't leave! You can't just leave him!" Elias did not stop. He went into the barn. She heard the sound of the horse, a surprised whinny. A moment later, he emerged, riding the bay. He was dressed for the weather, his hat pulled low, his duster on. He did not look at her as he rode past the cabin, pushing the horse into a fast, deep-trotting walk through the heavy snow. He disappeared into the trees. He was gone. Clara sank to her knees in the snowdrift. It was over. He had brought them here to die in peace. That was all. He had saved them from the alley only to let them perish in this silent, white wilderness. The hope she had foolishly allowed to grow turned to ash in her mouth. She crawled back inside the cabin, shut the door, and went to the cot to wait for her son to die. Elias rode for 6 hours. He did not spare the horse. He knew this land. He knew the rancher over the next ridge, a man who kept a good supply of quinine powder and laudanum for his own family. It was 10 miles, through drifts as high as a man's chest, in cold that froze the sweat on the horse's flanks. He rode with a single, burning image in his mind. He was in Texas. It was 6 years ago. He had been gone for 4 months on a cattle drive to Kansas. 4 long, dry, dusty months. He'd had his pay in his pocket, a doll for his wife, Maria, and wooden soldiers for his 2-year-old son, Daniel. He had been humming as he rode the last mile. He had seen the cabin. It was quiet. There was no smoke from the chimney. It was a cold spring day, but the stove was cold. He had swung down from his horse, his heart suddenly a block of ice. He had pushed the door open. Maria? The silence, the terrible, waxy silence of a room where death had been. They were in the bed. She had held the baby to her chest. The fever had taken them both. They had been dead for days. While he was in Kansas, laughing with the other men, his wife and son had died alone. He had not been there. The quinine that might have saved them had been in a town 20 miles away, but he had not been there to ride for it. The guilt was a living thing. It had hollowed him out, burned away everything inside him until he was just a shell. He had buried them. He had sold the land. And he had ridden north until he could not feel his own face, until the past was a frozen, distant thing he could almost pretend had happened to another man. Now, it was happening again, a fever, a child, a mother with terrified eyes. He rode the bay into the ground. He reached the ranch, got the medicine, paying the rancher double what it was worth, and he turned around and rode back without a word of explanation. It was full dark when he returned. The horse was stumbling, its head low, its coat white with frozen lather. Elias himself was a statue of ice, his beard a solid mass, his hands numb. He swung from the saddle in the barn and did not even take the time to unsaddle the horse. He grabbed the small bottle of laudanum and the packet of white quinine powder and walked to the cabin. He kicked the door open, not bothering to knock. Clara screamed. She was kneeling by the cot, rocking back and forth, holding Henry's limp hand. She thought it was a syndicate man. She thought it was the end. Elias stalked past her, the snow melting from his coat and hissing on the floor. He laid the bottle and the packet on the table. Clara stared at them. What is it?" "Medicine," he rasped. His throat was raw from the cold. "For the fever, the powder and water. A few drops of the laudanum if the coughing gets bad, not too much." He stood there, swaying, exhausted. He had done it. He had not been too late. Clara looked from the medicine to his face. His skin was gray with fatigue. Ice was melting in his beard, dripping onto his coat. He had ridden through the wilderness. For her, for Henry, for... You came back." Elias just looked at her, his eyes hollow. He nodded once, then turned and left, closing the door. Clara ran to the table. With shaking hands, she mixed the powder in a cup of water. She lifted Henry's head. "Henry, please, baby, you have to drink." For the next 2 days, Clara and Elias fought the fever together, though they rarely spoke. She would tend to Henry, forcing the bitter medicine down his throat, cooling his face, changing the sweat-soaked rags. Elias would come in, his face set, and check the boy. He would spell her, sitting in the chair, just watching. The one time the fever seemed to spike, he had, with a strange and practiced gentleness, unwrapped the boy from the blankets and held his bare chest against his own, rubbing his back until the shivering subsided. Clara watched him. She saw the way his large, scarred hands were careful with her son. She saw the way he looked at the fire, his mind 1,000 miles away. He was a man drowning in a memory. And she, in turn, worked as Henry's fever slowly, finally, began to recede. She took over the cabin. She washed his clothes. She mended his socks. She scrubbed the floor. She baked bread with his flour. And this time, it was light. It was a small, warm, clean space. It was a home. Elias would watch her. He would sit at the table while she cooked, the smell of baking bread filling the small room. It was a smell he had not known for 6 years. It hurt him. It hurt him to see her moving in this space, to see Ruthie playing on the floor with a wooden spoon, to hear the sound of a woman humming. It was a life he had buried. He was terrified of it. He would stand up abruptly, his chair scraping, and flee to the barn, to the cold, safe smell of leather and hay. On the 5th night, Henry was asleep. His fever was gone. His breathing was deep and even. He was pale, but he was alive. Clara sat in the other chair. The fire in the stove crackled. Elias had not left. He was sitting at the table, staring at his hands. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was not empty. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "I thought you had left us." Elias did not look up. "I went for the medicine." "You came back." She said it again, a statement of wonder. She looked at her hands, which were now clean, but still red and cracked. I do not understand. No one has ever... Not since Silas. Why? Why are you doing this for us? What do you want?" She was shaking. She had to know. Was she his prisoner? Was she his property? Was she expected to pay for this, for her son's life, in the way men usually expected? Elias was silent for a long time. The fire snapped. The wind moaned softly around the cabin eaves. He seemed to be weighing his words, or finding them from a place they had been buried for a long time. He finally raised his head. He looked at her. His eyes were clear, and the hollow, haunted look was gone, replaced by a simple, profound exhaustion. "When I saw you," he said, his voice a low gravel, "in that alley, with your children, you looked the way I used to feel, the way I felt every day. Empty, colder than the wind. He looked at Henry, asleep on the cot. I had a son. He died of a fever like this. I was not there. He looked back at Clara. I could not be not there again. Clara stared at him. It was not an answer she had expected. It was not about her, not really. It was not about lust, or power, or even kindness. It was about pain. He had looked at her, and he had seen his own broken reflection. She did not say thank you. The words were too small. She just sat there, in the warm, quiet cabin. And for the first time since Silas died, she was not afraid. She was just still. Elias nodded, as if a great weight had been settled. He stood up. The horse needs tending. He went to the door, but this time he paused. The boy will be hungry when he wakes. There is a quarter sack of oats in the barn. You can make a porridge. He left. Clara watched the door close. She put her head down on the table, the clean wood cool against her hot cheek. And she did not cry. She just breathed. The Chinook winds came first, a warm, false breath from the mountains that ate the snow. The world, which had been a silent, white expanse, was revealed as brown and scarred, the ground frozen solid beneath the slush. Then the true thaw began. The world filled with the sound of dripping water, a constant, gentle percussion from the eaves of the cabin and the high branches of the pines. Small creeks, frozen and silent for months, began to gurgle and roar. The deep, hard-packed snows receded, leaving patches of wet, dark earth that smelled of iron and rot. Spring did not creep in. It fought its way through the cold, and with it, Henry fought his way back. His first day out of the cot, he was a pale ghost. Clara wrapped him in Elias's spare blanket and sat him in the chair by the open cabin door. The air was still cold, but the sun had a watery strength. Henry just sat, his eyes closed, breathing in air that did not smell of sickness and dust. Ruthie, who had been a quiet shadow, seemed to bloom with the light. She was outside constantly, her bare feet muddy, finding strange rocks and wet branches, presenting them to her mother as treasures. The cabin, which had been a fortress against the cold, now became a base. Elias, who had spent the deep winter in the barn, now seemed to own the land around it. He was always moving, his long frame bent to a task. He was mending the small pole corral, his axe strokes ringing sharp and clean in the thin air. He was clearing the spring-fed creek of winter debris, his shoulders straining as he rolled a heavy, waterlogged tree from its path. Clara watched him from the doorway. He had saved them. He had fed them from his own meager supplies. He had ridden for medicine. Now, the unspoken debt sat heavy in the air. She was not a guest. She was a burden. One morning, she put on her thin shawl, walked out to the woodpile where he was splitting the last of the winter-cured pine, and picked up the smaller hand axe. Elias stopped, his maul resting on the block. He watched her. She was thin, her dress worn, but her jaw was set. What are you doing, Clara? You need firewood hauled. I can haul it. That's my work. It's my fire, too, she said, her voice quiet but fierce. It's my children eating your food. I will not be charity. I will work. Show me what needs doing. Elias looked at her for a long time. He saw the pride, the same desperate ferocity she'd had in the alley. It was not broken. He nodded slowly. The wood is split. It needs to be stacked on the porch, to dry for next winter. And the garden plot by the creek needs to be turned. It's too rocky for the plow horse. He did not offer her the easy tasks. He offered her the truth. So they began. It was a new silent language spoken in shared labor. Clara had not known work like this. It was not the scalding, lie-sore work of the wash-house. This was earthwork, bone work. She helped him clear the garden, a small, hopeful patch of land near the creek. They cleared it of stones, their hands, large and small, working side by side. dropping the rocks into a wooden sledge Elias had built. Her hands, already cracked, bled. She did not complain. She wrapped them in rags and kept working. Elias would watch her, his face grim. One evening, he came in from the barn and silently placed a small tin on the table. It was axle grease, thick and black. Clara looked at it, then at him, confused. "For your hands," he said, his voice rough. "At night, it'll keep the cracks from splitting open." He left before she could thank him. That night, by the fire, she rubbed the foul-smelling grease into her palms. It was a strange, coarse and profound act of tenderness. The land was hard, but it was honest. Every rock they cleared, every seed they planted, a few potatoes and beans he'd had in a tin, was a victory. They fixed the fence on the small chicken coop, where 3 scrawny hens survived. They hauled wood until the porch was stacked high, a bulwark against a winter that was still half a year away. They fell into a rhythm. Up before dawn, coffee, boiled black and bitter. Work, a midday meal of flatbread and, sometimes, a piece of smoked venison from a deer Elias had killed. Work. Then dusk, the children fed, the fire stoked. In the long, weary evenings, they would sit at the small table, the lamp casting a low, yellow light. The children slept on the cot. Clara had taken the floor. On a pallet she made of pine boughs and her own quilt. Elias still slept in the barn. In these silences, pieces of him came loose. "You handle a horse well," she said one night, mending Ruthie's dress. Elias was cleaning his rifle, his movements economical and precise. He did not look up. "Born on one. In Texas." He nodded. "Was that where you were a soldier?" His hand stopped. He was perfectly still. He stared at the rifle's breech. "I was, for a time." "The war?" "Yes." What was it like?" He set the cleaning rod down. He looked at the wall, at the shadows cast by the lamp. "It was loud," he said, his voice flat. "And it was a long way from home." He picked up the rod and began to work again. The subject clearly closed. Another night, she asked him about the scar. He touched it, a reflexive, unconscious gesture. "Barbed wire. Up in Montana. Got throwed from a spooked horse. I roamed a bit, after the fever." He had come west to escape memory. He had run from Texas, from the ghosts of his wife and son, from the man he had been. He had ridden aimlessly, taking work where he could find it, breaking horses, driving cattle, even a short, grim stint as a guard on a freight wagon. He had ended up here, at the Bar Z, working for wages, and then claiming this small, isolated patch in the foothills, a place so remote no one else wanted it. He had come here not to live, but to be left alone. Clara understood. She, too, had wanted to be invisible, but the world would not let her. The children, however, had no patience for grief. Henry, his strength returning, became a boy again. He was quiet, not like Ruthie, but his eyes followed Elias with a silent, hungry worship. Elias was the man who had brought the medicine. Elias was the man who could split a log with one blow, who could tame the big bay horse. One afternoon, Elias was working on the bay's hoof in the corral. Ruthie and Henry watched from the fence, 2 small, pale faces. "Can I touch him?" Ruthie asked, her voice small. Elias finished with the hoof, dropping it gently. He straightened up and looked at her. He seemed to consider it. He's not a pet, he's a work animal, but he's steady. He walked to the horse's head, rubbing its nose, murmuring something low. He turned to the children. "Come here, slow." They slipped through the fence. He lifted Ruthie first, setting her on the broad, bare back of the horse. She gasped, her small hands grabbing the coarse mane. "I'm high, Mama, look, I'm high." Clara came to the cabin door, her hands white with flour. She watched, her heart in her throat. Elias held Ruthie steady with one hand on her leg. Then he lifted Henry, placing him behind his sister. Henry was weaker, and he wrapped his arms tightly around Ruthie's waist, his face buried in her back. Elias took the horse's lead. He did not look at Clara. He began to walk the horse in a slow, tight circle inside the corral. Ruthie's initial fear melted into a bright, pealing laugh that echoed off the pines. It was a sound Clara had not heard in over a year. And then Clara saw it. Elias was looking at the children, his head turned. The grim, set line of his mouth had softened. His eyes, usually so distant, were focused and clear. A small, faint smile touched the corners of his lips. It was a brief, painful, and beautiful thing. It was the first time she had ever seen it. He was looking at her children, and for a second, he was not seeing the ghosts of his own. That smile, more than the medicine, more than the warm cabin, was the thing that broke her heart. Her gratitude, her respect, her deep, aching thankfulness. It all began to braid together into something warmer, something more dangerous. She felt a pull toward this silent, scarred man. It terrified her. She looked down at her left hand, at the thin, worn gold band on her ring finger. Silas, her husband, the father of her children. He was dead, murdered. The grief was still there, a cold stone in her stomach. To feel this new warmth for Elias felt like a betrayal. It felt like she was forgetting the man whose memory she was bound to honor. She suppressed it. She pushed it down, burying it under the hard, daily work. The work and the rifle. A coyote, brave and hungry after the long winter, had been circling the cabin. One dawn, they woke to a high-pitched, terrible squawking. Elias was out of the barn in an instant, his rifle in hand. He was too late. The coyote was loping back toward the trees, one of their 3 precious hens dangling from its jaws. Elias cursed, a low, savage sound. He did not fire. The animal was already gone. He stood there, staring at the feathers scattered on the ground. 3 hens. Now 2. That was their eggs. That was their food. Clara came out. She saw the feathers, and her stomach tightened with a familiar, cold dread. Elias turned to her. His face was hard. "You have to learn to shoot." "What?" "I am not always here. I ride for the Bar Z 3 days a week to earn wage money for salt and cartridges. You are here, alone, with the children. You will learn to shoot." "No," she said, backing away. I can't. Silas, the men who—" She thought of her husband's broken body. The rifle was the symbol of that, of violence, of death. "This ain't about them," Elias said, his voice sharp. "This is about that—" He pointed to the trees where the coyote had vanished. "That is a predator. It will be back for the other 2. It will take them. Then it will get hungry again. It will look at Ruthie. It will look at Henry. You will learn." He took her to a clearing, away from the cabin. He set a tin can on a stump 50 yards away. The rifle was heavy in her hands. It smelled of oil and burnt powder. "It's too heavy. I can't hold it." "You can," he said. He stood behind her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid wall. "Brace it. Against your shoulder. Tight. Or it will kick you. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it. Slow. Look down the sight. Line up the top of the post with the can. Let your breath out, then squeeze." She was shaking. Her first shot kicked up dirt 10 feet to the left. The sound of it, a flat, hard crack that echoed, made her flinch. She dropped the rifle. "I can't—" "Pick it up." She did. She shot again, and again. She missed. She was crying in frustration, angry at him, angry at the coyote, angry at her own weakness. "Stop thinking about the noise," he said, his voice low and steady. "Stop thinking about the kick. Just see the can. See nothing else. Squeeze." She took a deep breath. She blocked out the memory of Silas. She blocked out the town. She saw only the small, glinting piece of tin on the stump. She let her breath out. She squeezed. The rifle bucked. A sharp ping echoed back. The can flew off the stump. She stood stunned. He had been right. She could. Elias took the rifle from her. Good, now you know. It was an act of provision, more real than a sack of flour. He had given her a tool of power. She was still hesitant, but the fear was mixed with a new, cold resolve. She would protect her children. Their isolation was their peace, but it could not last. The foothills were not empty. A week later, a man on horseback rode by. It was Mr. Abernethy, the husband of the woman from the butcher shop. His land bordering the Bar Z range. He was checking his fences. He saw Elias in the corral. Then he saw Clara, hanging laundry on a line she had strung. Then he saw the two children. He stopped his horse. He did not dismount. He stared at Clara, his eyes taking in her worn dress, her bare feet, her hair tied in a ragged bun. He looked at Elias. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more insult than greeting. Mr. Vaughn, he said to Elias, did not take you for a family man. Elias just stared at him, his face stone. Abernethy's gaze lingered on Clara again, a slow, appraising look that made her skin crawl. Seems you found the widow a new situation. She cleans up better than she did in town. Before Clara could speak, Elias had moved from the corral to Abernethy's horse. He did not run. He just arrived. He did not reach for the man. He just grabbed the horse's bridle, his grip like a steel trap. The horse tossed its head, startled. You are on my claim, Abernethy, Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. Your fence line is 2 miles east. Ride on. Abernethy, a man used to bluster, found none in himself. He looked at Elias's eyes, cold and flat as a frozen lake, and at the hand on his bridle, he pulled his reins. No offense meant, just making an observation. Ride on. Abernethy yanked his horse's head free and spurred it, riding away fast. Clara was shaking, the wet laundry forgotten in her hands. She had brought the stain. She had brought the town's poison to his quiet land. I am sorry, she whispered, looking at the ground. Elias did not answer. He watched Abernethy disappear, his jaw working. He went to the barn and did not come out again until dark. The gossip reached town in a day. It flew from the Abernethy ranch to the general store to the saloon. The cursed widow, Clara, living in sin with that scarred ranch hand, had 2 children right there in the cabin with them. It was a sour, satisfying story for the town. It confirmed everything they believed about her. 2 days later, Elias had to ride to the Bar Z for his pay. He returned just after dusk. He was quiet, but it was a different silence. It was not his usual peace. It was a coiled, angry thing. He stalked into the cabin, threw his small sack of pay on the table, and went to the stove to pour coffee. Clara watched him. His back was rigid. What happened? She asked. Nothing. Elias, what happened in town? He turned, the tin cup in his hand. They were talking about me. It was not a question. About us, he corrected, his voice low. The shame was overwhelming. She had done it again. She had cursed him. She had taken his kindness and rewarded him with public disgrace. She stood up, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. I will not bring this to you. You, who saved us. It's just talk. Clara. It is not. It is what they did to Silas. It is what they did to me. They call me bad luck. They whisper. And then it gets worse. I will not have them do it to you. I will not be the reason they look at you the way they looked at me. She took a shaking breath. We will leave. In the morning. Henry is strong enough. We will walk. We will go. Somewhere else. She was offering to leave, to go back to the mud, to the starvation, to protect his reputation. Elias stared at her. The anger in his face warred with something else, something pained and confused. He was not a man of words. He could not tell her what she had become to him. He could not explain that her presence in the cabin, the smell of her baking bread, the sound of her children, had been the first things to make him feel alive in 6 years. He could not tell her that the idea of the cabin being empty again was more terrifying than any gossip. He could not say any of that. So he just looked at her, the pain raw in his eyes, and he shook his head. A single, sharp gesture. "I told you this was home." He said it with a finality that stunned her. It was not an invitation. It was a statement, a fact, like the mountains, like the sky. The air in the cabin was thick, charged with all the things they could not say. He had refused her sacrifice. He had chosen her, and the children, over his name, over the town, over the easy silence he had once craved. Clara looked at him, at his scarred face, at the weariness in his eyes, the gratitude, the respect, the warmth she had been fighting. It broke free. It was a wave that washed away the guilt. Just for a second. She took a step toward him. He did not move. She reached up, her hand shaking, and she touched the scar on his cheek. He flinched, but did not pull away. His skin was rough beneath her fingers. He closed his eyes, a pained expression on his face, as if her touch was a brand. "Elias," she whispered. He opened his eyes. He looked at her, and she saw it. Not just his own pain, but hers. He saw her. He leaned in, slowly, his hand coming up to cover hers on his cheek. His other hand found her waist, his grip hesitant, unsteady. This was unknown territory, more dangerous than any blizzard. She leaned into him, her eyes closing. She could smell the pine and leather and cold air on his skin. This was happening. This was real. They were inches apart. His breath was warm on her face. And then her hand, the one not on his face, brushed the front of her dress. Her fingers hit the cold, hard circle of her wedding ring. Silas. Her eyes flew open. A jolt, cold as ice water, shot through her. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, choked her. She was a widow. She was a wife. She was betraying him. She pulled back, a small, strangled sound in her throat. She wrenched her hand from his grasp, stumbling back until she hit the table. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, I can't." Elias stood frozen, his hand still raised. The rejection was a physical blow. The small, hopeful warmth in his face died, replaced by the familiar, stoic mask. He did not understand. He had offered her a home. He had stood against the town. He thought. He let his hands fall to his sides. He looked at her hand which was now clutching her wedding ring through the thin fabric of her dress. He understood. He gave a single, curt nod. He turned, grabbed his coat from the peg, and walked out of the cabin, closing the door softly behind him. Clara sank into the chair, her head on the table, and finally, she sobbed. Outside, the first fat drops of a cold spring rain began to fall. Elias did not go to the barn. He stood on the small porch, his hand resting on the rough-hewn post. He stared out into the darkness, at the rain falling on the newly turned earth of their garden. He did not move for a very long time, his heart heavy, the sound of the rain a cold, lonely drumbeat. The rain that had begun the night Clara pulled away from him did not stop. It settled over the foothills with a cold, gray persistence, turning the world to mud and misery. For 3 days, it drummed on the cabin roof, a constant, dreary reminder of the new, awkward silence that had fallen between them. They still worked. The rhythm of their days, forged in the harshness of winter, was too strong to be broken by a single, painful moment. Elias still brought in the wood, his face a stoic, unreadable mask. Clara still cooked, her movements precise and contained. They moved around each other in the small cabin, their bodies careful not to brush, their eyes careful not to meet. The air was thick with the things that had not been said, with the kiss that had almost been, and the guilt that had stopped it. Elias was gone more. He took his wages from the Bar Z, riding out in the pre-dawn darkness and returning after dusk, soaked to the bone. Clara knew he was giving her space, but it felt like a new kind of abandonment. He was a wall, and she was the one who had rebuilt it. On the 4th day of the rain, Elias rode out as usual. Clara was alone with the children. The cabin felt small, a trap. Henry, fully recovered, was restless, tracing patterns in the condensation on the single, small window. Ruthie was humming to a doll Clara had fashioned from a piece of canvas and some dried grass. A sound, not the rain, made Clara look up. A horse slogging through the mud. Her heart seized. Strangers were never good news. She pushed the children toward the cot. "Stay back. Be quiet." She went to the door, her hand gripping the iron skillet. She opened it a crack. It was not a man. It was a boy, maybe 15, on a sway-backed pony. He was soaked, his hat drooping over his face. He looked as scared as she felt. It was Caleb, the delivery boy from the general store. Mrs. Miller?" he stammered, his eyes wide at seeing her. He was lost. Clara's fear eased, replaced by a weary sort of pity. "You're a long way from town. Caleb, get down before you're soaked through." He stumbled into the cabin, dripping a puddle onto the floor, his eyes darting from Clara to the children to the clean, warm room. He was clearly shocked. This was not the hovel of the cursed widow he'd heard about in town. I was trying to get to the Abernethy place," he said, shivering. "With a delivery. This rain, I must have taken the wrong fork." "You did," Clara said. She poured him a tin cup of hot coffee from the pot on the stove. He took it in trembling, blue-white hands. "Abernethy is 5 miles east." "Thank you, ma'am." He drank the coffee, the warmth bringing some life back to him. He was a boy, and the gossip in him was stronger than his fear. "It's a bad day to be out. Town's all riled up anyway." "Oh," Clara said, her back to him, pretending to wipe the table. "Yes, ma'am. That lawyer, Mr. Finch, the one for the cattle syndicate? He's in town. He just nailed a notice to the courthouse door. Big as life." Clara stopped wiping. The rag was still in her hand. Caleb, oblivious, pressed on. "It's an auction. For a piece of land. The one your husband, you know, the one he claimed. They're selling it. Next week, Mr. Abernethy himself is aiming to bid." The cup in Clara's hand did not shake. Her whole body went perfectly, icily still. The past, which she had been fighting, which she had been honoring, had just reached out and put its hand on her throat. They were not just content to have murdered Silas. They were going to steal the last trace of him, the very land he had died for. "I see," Clara said, her voice a flat, dead thing. The boy, feeling the sudden chill, finished his coffee and stood up. I best be going. Thank you for the coffee, ma'am." Clara showed him out. She pointed him in the right direction. She watched him ride away, a small, hunched figure in the gray curtain of rain. Then she closed the door. She did not cry. She did not rage. A cold, hard resolve settled into her bones. This was not Elias's fight. This was hers. This was about Silas. This was the one thing Elias, with his kindness and his quiet protection, could not understand. She had pushed him away to honor her husband's memory, and now that memory was being spat upon. To ask Elias to fight this battle, too, would be the final, unforgivable burden. She would not do it. She would not hide behind him while the last piece of her old life was auctioned off like a common chair. She waited an hour. The children were quiet, playing on the cot. She packed them bread and a canteen of water. She wrapped them both in the quilt. "I have to go to town," she said, her voice calm. Henry looked up, his eyes wide. "Town?" "It is, to see about your father's land. I will be back before dark. You are not to open the door. For anyone, do you understand me?" Henry, who had seen his mother's desperation before, just nodded. Ruthie, sensing the hard edge in her mother's voice, was silent. Clara put on her worn shawl. She went to the barn. Elias's bay, a magnificent, powerful animal, was gone, but the mare, a sturdy, placid horse they used for plowing and hauling, was there. She had never saddled a horse herself. Elias always did it. It took her 3 tries, her hands clumsy and shaking, but she got the heavy saddle on. She led the mare out into the relentless rain and pulled herself up. She turned the horse's head toward Wind River Crossing and did not look back. Elias returned an hour later. He had cut his day short at the Bar Z, a sour, guilty feeling in his gut. The silence at the cabin was his fault. He was a fool. He had pushed. He should have waited. He rode into the small clearing and his blood went cold. The mare was gone. He swung off the bay before it had even stopped, his boots sucking in the mud. He burst into the cabin. "Clara?" 2 small, terrified faces peered at him from the cot. "Where is your mother?" She went to town, Pa," Henry whispered. The name Pa barely registered. Town. Alone. On the slow plodding mare. "How long?" A while ago," Henry said, his lip trembling. Elias's fury was a cold, sharp blade, not at Clara, at himself, at the town, at the world. He had left her alone, after Abernethy's visit, after the rumors. He had left her alone, and now she had run. Had she run from him? Then his eyes fell on the small, carved wooden box on the mantel, the one he had never seen her open, the one that held Silas's things. It was open, and it was empty. He understood. This was not about him, this was about her husband. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, where she had gone. He remembered the talk at the Bar Z, the whispers, the lawyer, the auction. "Fool!" he snarled at himself. He had thought it was just saloon gossip. He looked at the children. They were safe. There was food. He stoked the fire until it was roaring. "I am going to get her. Do not open that door. I will be back. With your mother." He did not resaddle. He just swung back onto the bay, the horse already tired but sensing the desperate urgency in its rider. He dug his heels in, and the horse lunged, spraying mud, back toward the town he had just left. Clara had arrived. The mare was slow, and the ride had been a long, cold, wet hell. She was soaked through, her dress clinging to her, her hair in long, wet strands. She tied the mare to the rail outside the courthouse. The town was watching, from the dry cover of the saloon porch, from the windows of the general store. They watched. The cursed widow, back again, looking like a drowned rat. She did not care. She walked up the wooden steps of the courthouse, the rain sluicing off her. The notice was there, just as Caleb had said. Nailed to the wood. Public auction, by order of the North Plains Cattle Syndicate. The door to the courthouse opened, and Mr. Finch, the lawyer, stepped out. He was holding a briefcase, about to leave for the hotel. He wore a fine wool coat and a derby hat. He stopped, surprised. "Well," he said, a small, amused smile on his lips. "Mrs. Miller, this is an unexpected pleasure." "You can't sell that land," Clara said. Her voice was shaking, but not from fear, from rage. "Madam, it is already done. The notice is posted. The law is being followed." "It's my land," she cried, her voice rising. The townsfolk on the street had edged closer, forming a damp, silent semicircle. It was my husband's. He filed the claim. He worked it. You... He did not, I'm afraid, Finch said, his tone one of false sympathy. He failed to make the required improvements. A technicality, but a fatal one. The claim defaulted to the territory. And as you, a woman, have no legal standing to inherit an unproven federal claim. He was murdered, she screamed. Your men murdered him for it. Finch's smile tightened. He had had enough. You are hysterical, madam, and you are making a scene. Your husband died in a tragic accident. The sheriff ruled it so. Now, I suggest you go home, or wherever it is you are staying these days. He stepped past her, but he could not resist the final, cruel twist. He stopped and looked back at her, his eyes cold. Besides, Mrs. Miller, it seems you found other accommodations. I'm told your new guardian is quite capable. Perhaps he can buy the land for you, if he can hold it any better than your husband did. The raw public insult hung in the wet air. He was calling her a whore. He was mocking Silas's death. The townsfolk shuffled, some grinning, some looking away, ashamed. Clara's hand flew up to strike him, but a new shadow had fallen. Elias was there. He had come up the steps behind her, silent as a wolf. The crowd had parted for him, for the bay, for the look on his face. He was soaked, his duster black with rain, his hat pulled low. He did not look at Clara. His eyes were on Finch. He had heard it all. Finch's smile evaporated. He was facing a different kind of man. This was not a hysterical woman. This was a man with a scar and dead, cold eyes. Mr. Vaughn, Finch stammered. We were just discussing. Elias did not speak. He took one step, and he punched the lawyer in the mouth. It was not a barroom swing. It was a short, brutal, heavy blow that landed with the sound of wet wood splitting. Finch's head snapped back. He crumpled to the steps, his derby hat rolling into a puddle. Blood bloomed instantly from his split lip, bright red against his white shirt. The crowd gasped. The sheriff, who had been watching from his office window, suddenly looked away. Elias stood over the gasping lawyer. He did not give him a second glance. He grabbed Clara's arm. His grip was like a steel trap. You! He snarled, his voice a low, furious rumble. He was not saving her. He was angry. He hauled her down the steps. He did not drag her to his horse. He dragged her past it, past the staring, silent crowd, into the alley between the blacksmith and the saloon, the very alley where he had first found her. He pushed her back against the wet brick wall. The rain sluiced down on them, plastering her hair to her face, dripping from the brim of his hat. They were both breathing hard, their breath pluming in the cold. What did you think you were doing? He demanded, his voice low and shaking with rage. He was not yelling. He was worse. Leaving the children, coming here, did you think they would just give it to you because you asked? It was my fight, she threw back at him, her own anger rising to meet his. It was for Silas. It was not your concern. Not my concern, he laughed, a short, bitter sound. They killed him. Clara, they are murderers, and you walked right back to them. What did you think would happen? You think a piece of paper matters to men like that? I had to, she sobbed, her fists beating against his hard, wet coat. I had to. I can't keep taking from you, Elias. I can't hide behind you while they spit on his grave. Don't you see? Her anger broke, and the raw, terrible grief that had fueled her poured out. Everything I touch, I ruin. Everyone who helps me gets hurt. I cursed Silas. He was a good man, and he wanted that land, and I was his bad luck. And now you. I brought the shame to you. They... She could not repeat what Finch had said. I am cursed, Elias, she wept, her forehead pressed against his chest. Just let me go, please. It's the only way. Just let me go. He stood rigid for a moment, letting her cry, letting the poison out. His own anger was gone. burned away by her pain. This was not pride. This was guilt, a guilt he knew so well it tasted like iron in his own mouth. He grabbed her wrists, holding her still. Then, his touch gentled. He lifted his hands, calloused and wet, and cupped her face. He tilted her head up, forcing her to look at him. Her eyes were broken. He was looking at his own reflection. "Elias, please," she whispered. "You'll be hurt. Everyone." He did not let her finish. He kissed her. It was not the hesitant, gentle kiss of the cabin. It was desperate. It was real. It was a kiss of rain and mud and blood and anger and a fierce, terrible, claiming tenderness. It was not a kiss of love. Not yet. It was a kiss of choice, a vow. He poured all the words he did not have into that single, branding act. He broke the kiss, but did not let her go. He rested his forehead against hers. They were both shaking. "You'll be hurt," she whispered again, her voice dead. He looked into her eyes. "Then I'll take the hurt," he said. The ride back to the cabin was a wordless eternity. The rain had not lessened. He put her on the mare and he rode the bay, side by side. He did not hold her. He did not speak, but he was there. When they reached the cabin, the children ran to the door, their faces pale. Clara rushed past Elias, dropping to her knees to hold them, burying her face in their small bodies, her shoulders shaking. Elias watched for a moment, his face grim. He unsaddled both horses, his movements economical, and tended to them, rubbing them down, giving them feed. He took his time. When he finally entered the cabin, it was dusk. The children were asleep on the cot, exhausted by their fear. Clara was sitting on the floor by the stove, staring into the flames. She was in a dry dress, her wet one hanging near the fire. She had taken his dry blanket from his pack and wrapped it around her shoulders. He came in, his boots loud on the wood floor. He said nothing. He poured coffee, then took a second cup, walked over, and handed it to her. She took it. Her hand was shaking. He sat on the floor, not beside her, but near, his back against the wall, sipping his own coffee. The only sounds were the rain on the roof and the crackle of the fire. "He's a murderer," she whispered, staring at the flames. "I know. He'll come for you, after what you did." "Let him—" She was silent. Then, slowly, she raised her left hand into the firelight. She looked at the thin gold band on her finger, the ring she had clung to, the symbol of the man she had tried to honor, the man whose memory had been twisted into a curse. "He was a good man," she said, her voice thick. "He did not deserve to be a ghost." Elias watched her. He did not speak. He just watched. Slowly, deliberately. Clara twisted the wedding ring on her finger. She pulled it, hard, over the raw, chapped knuckle. She held it in her palm for a moment, looking at it. Then she reached up and set it on the rough wrought mantel, next to the small wooden box. She had let him go. She turned her head and looked at Elias. Her eyes were red from weeping, but they were clear. And they were, for the first time, free. He did not move. He did not smile. He just held her gaze. She set her coffee cup down. She unfolded her legs and moved, crawling the small distance across the floor, until she was kneeling in front of him. He waited. She reached up, her hand still trembling, and touched his face, the scar, just as she had before. This time, he did not flinch. He did not pull away. He just closed his eyes. She leaned in, and this time, she kissed him. It was slow. It was gentle. It was salt and coffee and wood smoke. It was an answer. Elias's hands came up, not to her face, but to her shoulders, holding her, as if he were afraid she might break. He pulled her closer, out of the blanket, and into his own arms, against his own body, and it was a new kind of warmth. That night, they did not sleep, on the small pallet of pine boughs. with the rain drumming a lullaby on the roof and the children breathing deeply just a few feet away. Two broken, solitary people touched something whole again. It was not a night of passion. It was a night of mending. It was slow and careful and quiet. It was the touch of skin that had not known kindness in years. It was a gentle, fragile healing, a silent promise that the hurt was real, but it did not have to be borne alone. Elias woke before dawn. It was a habit from the war, from the trail. The cabin was still dark, the fire low. The rain had finally stopped. Clara was asleep, her face turned toward him, her breathing deep. For the first time since he had met her, the lines of fear and grief were gone from her face. She looked young. He sat up, careful not to wake her. He looked at her. He looked at the cot where Henry and Ruthie were tangled together. A feeling, fierce and protective and terrifying, swelled in his chest. These were his. The punch had been for Clara. What came next had to be for them. He stood and quietly pulled on his trousers and shirt. He went to his saddlebags and took out a small, leather-bound tin. Inside was a pencil stub, a few folded pieces of paper, and a tintype of a woman and a baby he had not looked at in 3 years. He set the picture aside, his hands shaking. He took the paper and pencil to the table. He lit the lamp, turning the wick low. He wrote, "To Captain John T. Albright, Federal Land Office, Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. John, you said if I ever needed anything, I need it now. It is Elias Vaughn. I am in Wind River Crossing." He paused, trying to find the words. He was not a man for letters. "There is a cattle syndicate here, North Plains. They are running a land grab. They murdered a settler for his claim. His name was Silas Miller. They paid the local sheriff to rule it an accident. Now they are auctioning the land. His widow and his 2 children are with me. The lawyer is named Finch. He works for them." He posted the notice. "I need a federal assessor. I need someone who is not on their payroll. I know this is your jurisdiction. I need you to come. I am calling in the debt. Vicksburg. You know the one." He signed it simply, Vaughn. He folded it, found an envelope, and addressed it. He would ride to the next town, 20 miles south, to post it. He would not trust the Wind River postmaster. He blew out the lamp. He looked at Clara, still asleep. He had taken on her hurt. Now he had to find a way to fight it. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. The rain was gone, replaced by a bright, clear, powerful spring sun. The world was green and alive. Elias moved his cot from the barn into the cabin. He moved his saddle, his tools, his rifle. It was done without a word, but it was a marriage. He and Clara worked side by side in the garden, their hands in the same earth. They ate at the same table. They slept on the same pallet. They spoke little, but they no longer needed to. A touch of his hand on her back as she passed. The way she handed him his coffee in the morning. It was a language deeper than words. The children, bright as new coats in the spring sun, felt the change. The fear was gone from the cabin. The tension was gone. Ruthie was the first. She was watching Elias whittle a piece of wood, a small bird taking shape under his knife. "Can I have some water, Pa?" The word, small and natural, hung in the warm afternoon air. Elias's knife stopped. Clara, hanging laundry, froze, a wooden pin in her hand. Elias looked at Ruthie. Her small, upturned face was open, expectant. He had given her brother medicine. He had put her on his horse. He slept beside her mother. He was the man in the cabin. He was Pa. He did not smile, but the hardness in his eyes softened. He nodded. "In the bucket," he said, and went back to whittling. Henry heard it. He watched his sister. The next day, he came running from the creek. "Pa! Pa! I found a frog!" Elias looked up from the fence he was mending. He looked at Clara. She was smiling. Not the faint, sad smile he had seen once before. A real smile. It changed her whole face. He looked back at Henry. Good, leave it be. The new rhythm had begun. They were a family. But Elias knew the letter was on its way, and the syndicate was in town. The fight was not over. It was just beginning. The peace of the new life lasted 8 days. It was a bright, cloudless morning. Elias was mending a piece of harness on the porch, the leather strong and supple in his hands. Clara was inside, kneading dough for bread, the sweet, yeasty smell filling the cabin. Henry and Ruthie were at the creek, their laughter a thin, bright sound in the air. Elias heard them first, the jingle of harness. Too many horses, coming too fast. He was on his feet in an instant, the harness forgotten. Clara, inside, get the children. Clara's face went white. She ran from the cabin, whistling, a sharp, piercing sound. The laughter at the creek stopped. She ran, her skirts hiked up, and half carried, half dragged the children back, pushing them through the cabin door. Elias had not moved from the porch. He stood, his feet planted, his hands empty but resting near the axe handle. 4 riders broke through the trees. Mr. Finch was in the lead, his face a swollen, purple-yellow mask. His lip was split and stitched, his nose crooked. He was not smiling. Beside him were 2 men Clara recognized as deputies from the town. They looked nervous, their eyes shifting, not meeting Elias's gaze. Behind them, 2 more men, hard-faced and unfamiliar, sat their horses, hired men. Their hands rested on the butts of their pistols. They stopped 20 feet from the porch. Vaughn, Finch spat, his voice thick from his broken mouth. You've caused me considerable trouble. This is my claim. Finch, you're trespassing, Elias said, his voice a low, calm rumble. Not according to this. Finch pulled a paper from his coat. This is an eviction notice, signed by Judge Potter himself. This land is part of the Bar Z grazing lease, which is held by the North Plains Syndicate. You, sir, are a squatter. And you, he sneered, looking past Elias to the cabin door, are harboring a vagrant and her offspring. Clara stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame. She had pushed the children behind her. She could feel Henry trembling. Ruthie, small and silent, had already slipped under the low table. The paper is a lie, Elias said. I filed on this claim. It's legal. The judge says otherwise. Finch said, enjoying this. Now, we're here to serve this notice. You and the woman will clear out immediately. No, Elias said. The simple word hung in the bright, clear air. The 2 deputies unhooked the leather straps on their holsters. The hired men behind them smiled. No, Finch repeated, incredulous. You are obstructing justice. Vaughn, that's a jailable offense, on top of the assault you committed on my person. You came onto my land, Elias said, his voice still level, with armed men to threaten my family. I'm not going anywhere. And she, he nodded toward Clara, is not going anywhere. Then we'll take you, Finch snapped. He nodded to the deputies. It was a standoff. 4 guns against 1 man with an axe. Elias knew he was dead. He might take 1, maybe 2, but they would burn the cabin. They would take Clara. You can try, Elias said, his body coiled, ready to spring. Clara watched, her heart a cold stone in her chest. This was it, the curse. It had finally come. He had taken the hurt, and now it was going to kill him. Wait, Elias held up a hand. He had seen the deputies' faces. They were not killers. They were townsmen, on a payroll, but they were scared. He had to give them a way out. This is not about this claim, Elias said, his eyes on Finch. This is about the Miller land. Finch's face tightened. And it's about this. Elias touched the scar on his own cheek, a gesture for Finch's broken face. You want me. You don't want them. He stepped off the porch, his hands raised, open. You want law? he said, loud enough for the deputies to hear clearly. "Let's have it. I'll ride to town with you. Right now. I'll stand in front of Judge Potter. And I'll testify." Finch's arrogance wavered.
"Testify about what? Your assault?"
"About murder," Elias said. The deputies looked at each other. The hired men stopped smiling. "I'll testify." Elias went on, his voice like stones dropping in a well. "That I was at the Bar Z the day Silas Miller died. I'll testify I saw Hatcher and Boone ride in late." He named the two men. "I'll testify they were covered in mud from the river bottom, and they were buying drinks at the saloon. Bragging about how Miller's claim was clear. Bragging about how that stupid Nestor took a bad fall off the river bluff."
"That's a lie,"
Finch yelled, his horse skittish. "Is it?" Elias looked past him, at the deputies. "I'll say it under oath, in an open courtroom, in front of the whole town. Is that what you want, Finch? You want to put Miller's murder on the public record? Or do you just want me?" It was a brilliant, desperate gamble. He was offering himself to save the cabin. He was daring Finch to risk a public trial, one that could expose the entire syndicate. Finch saw his advantage crumble. The deputies were not looking at Elias anymore. They were looking at Finch, their faces pale. They were lawmen, not accessories to murder. You're lying," Finch stammered. "Ask your men. Ask Hatcher and Boone." Elias said, "Let's all go to town. We'll settle it." Finch was trapped. He could not order his men to fire on an unarmed man who was offering to testify. He could not let that testimony happen, but maybe he could. He controlled the judge. He controlled the town. He could discredit this lone, scarred cowboy. He could paint him as a liar, a violent brute who had taken up with a cursed widow. "Fine," Finch spat. "You ride with us, now, alone." "Elias, no!" Clara ran from the porch, her face a mask of terror. She grabbed his arm. "They'll kill you. They'll never let you get to the courthouse. It's not worth it. Elias, we can go. We can leave. Please." Elias looked at her. He put his hand over hers on his arm. His face was set, calm. The panic was gone. He knew his path. "I told you I'd take the hurt," he whispered, for her alone. "I'm not running. This is home." He kissed her, hard and fast, a public act of ownership and promise. It was a kiss that sealed their fate. He turned to Finch. "One condition. You and your men ride out first. I'll follow. I give you my word. I won't run, but I want you away from my family." Finch, eager to get him to town, agreed. He and his men turned their horses and rode out of the clearing. Elias turned back to Clara. He took her by the shoulders. "Listen to me. There is no time. Bar the door. From the inside, use the table. Do not open it. For anyone but me." I can't let you go." "You must." He pushed her gently toward the cabin. He went to the porch wall, where his own rifle was mounted. He took it down. He took the box of cartridges. He pushed them into her hands, the rifle she had learned to use. "You know how," he said. "Protect the children. Protect this home. I will be back." He did not wait for her answer. He strode to the barn, pulled the saddle onto the bay, and mounted up. He looked at her one last time, a long, deep look. Then he spurred the horse, riding out after them, an unarmed man, surrounded by his enemies. Clara stood, the rifle heavy in her hands, until he disappeared. Then she herded the children inside, dragged the heavy table, and barricaded the door. She waited. An hour passed. The silence of the cabin was a living, screaming thing. Every gust of wind was a rider. Every snap of a branch was a gunshot. 2 hours. She was going mad. She could see it all in her mind. An ambush on the trail, a shot in the back, Elias lying in the mud, just as Silas had. She looked at the children, huddled on the cot. She looked at the rifle. He had told her to protect the home. But he was the home. "Get your shawls," she said, her voice a harsh croak. "Mama?" Henry said, his eyes wide. "We are going now." She did not bother with the saddle. She put a bridle on the slow mare. She unbarred the door. She loaded the rifle, her hands shaking, but sure. She put Henry on the horse's back and pulled Ruthie up in front of him. She took the reins, the rifle in her other hand. "Hold on," she told them. She did not ride the trail. She kept to the trees, moving through the deep woods, parallel to the path, her eyes scanning the mud for the tracks of the 5 horses. She was a ghost, fueled by a cold, pure terror. She was not a widow. Running, she was a wife. Hunting. It took her almost 2 hours to reach the town. She tied the mare in a copse of trees at the edge of the settlement and led the children on foot, keeping to the alleys. She could hear a noise, a crowd. She emerged behind the blacksmith's shop, her old, cursed alley. The main street was full, not in a celebratory way. It was a still, tense crowd, all facing the courthouse. She saw them. Elias was on the courthouse steps. He was standing alone. Finch was there, and Judge Potter, looking pale and sick. The 2 syndicate men, Hatcher and Boone, were at the bottom of the steps, their hands on their guns, their faces angry. Clara pushed through the back of the crowd, pulling her children with her. She found a spot on the boardwalk, near a support post, shielded from view but with a clear line of sight. She held the rifle, pointed down, hidden by her skirts. Elias was speaking. His voice was not loud, but it carried in the dead, heavy silence. "Hey, and I saw them. Judge Potter," he was saying, his words clear and cutting. "I saw them at the Golden Nugget, and I heard them. Hatcher," he pointed a long, steady finger at the man, "said Miller was a stubborn fool who should have known better than to fight the river, and Boone," he pointed at the other, "said he sure fell a long way."
This is hearsay,
Finch shouted, his voice cracking.
It's slander from a known brawler.
"Is it?" Elias's voice cut through his.
Then put them under oath. Put me under oath.
Let's ask Mr. Hatcher why his shirt was torn and his knuckles were bloody when he rode in that day. Hatcher's hand twitched toward his gun. The crowd murmured. They had all heard the rumors. Now, here was a man they knew as silent and solitary, naming names, in public. Judge Potter banged his gavel. "Order, order. Mr. Vaughn, you are making very serious accusations. They are true." "You have no proof," Finch screamed. "On the contrary, Mr. Finch." A new voice, calm, educated, and cold, cut through the air. A man was walking through the crowd, which parted for him. He was in a dark suit, clean-shaven, and he wore a hat. He also wore a federal marshal's badge, pinned to his vest. He walked up the steps and stood beside Elias, turning to face the judge. "Judge Potter," the man said. "I am John Albright, federal land assessor for the Wyoming Territory. I arrived on the morning stage." He held up a leather satchel. "I am here to conduct a full review of the claim filed by Silas Miller, registry number 44B. It seems there are significant irregularities, beginning with the fact that the claim was never legally forfeited." Elias looked at his friend. John Albright had not changed. He was older, but his eyes were the same. He gave Elias a single, short nod. He had gotten the letter. Finch's face went from purple to gray. The judge looked as if he were about to be sick. A federal marshal. "Here." Albright looked at the notice, still nailed to the door. He tore it down. "This," he said, "is illegal. The North Plains Syndicate has no right to this land. Nor," he said, his voice hardening, "does Mr. Abernethy. My office has a copy of Mr. Miller's original, valid filing." He looked at the crowd. "As Mr. Miller is deceased, and this land was his legally filed property, it passes to his next of kin, his wife, Mrs. Clara Miller." He turned to the judge, his voice iron. "Judge Potter, you will sign the order transferring the title to her. Immediately." and I suggest you open an inquest into the death of Silas Miller, starting with Mr. Hatcher and Mr. Boone." The crowd erupted. It was a roar. The judge, his hands trembling, his career over, stumbled back inside his office. Finch was forgotten, a broken man on the steps. Clara was weeping, her hand over her mouth, the rifle leaning against her leg. It was over. Silas. It was over. Elias's shoulders, which had been rigid for hours, finally slumped. He turned, his eyes searching the crowd, finding her instantly. He saw her. He saw the children. He smiled, a true, weary smile. He started down the steps. But it was not over. Hatcher and Boone, their faces masks of sweat and terror, were trapped. They had been named. They were going to hang. They had nothing to lose.
"Vaughn!"
Hatcher roared. They both drew. They were fast. They were aiming for the man who had condemned them. Elias was in the middle of the street, his back to them, his hands empty. Clara screamed, "Elias!" She did not think. She did not aim. She did not remember the kick, or the noise, or the fear. She just saw the man she loved. She saw the tin can on the stump. She raised the rifle, her body moving with the instinct Elias had drilled into her. She lined up the sight on Hatcher's chest. She let out her breath. She squeezed. The crack of the rifle was deafening, echoing off the buildings. Hatcher's body spun around as if hit by a giant, invisible fist. His shot went wide, splintering the boardwalk. He stared, his eyes wide with a terrible surprise. At his chest, where a dark, wet circle was blooming, he crumpled to the mud. The street went dead silent. Boone froze, his own gun half raised. The federal marshal, Albright, had his pistol drawn and leveled. "Drop it," Albright commanded. Boone's gun thudded into the mud. He raised his hands high. Elias had spun around, his hand reaching for a gun that was not there. He saw Hatcher on the ground, not moving. He saw Boone, his hands up. He saw Albright. And then he saw Clara. She was standing on the boardwalk, frozen, the rifle still held at her shoulder, a small curl of smoke rising from the barrel. Her face was paper white. Her eyes were wide, staring at the man she had just shot. This was her first kill. The townsfolk were staring at her, not as a curse, not as a beggar. They were staring at her with a new, stunned awe. This was the woman who had just shot down a syndicate gunman in the middle of the street to save her man. Elias ran to her. He did not go to Hatcher. He did not speak to Albright. He ran to her. He put his hand on the rifle, gently prying her fingers from the stock. Her hand was locked tight. "Clara," he said, his voice low. She looked at him. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. I... He took the rifle. He grabbed her hand, her empty, trembling hand. He did not look angry. He did not look shocked. He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a fierce, profound, and stunned pride. He squeezed her hand, hard, a jolt that brought her back to the earth. He pulled her against his side, turning to face the crowd, his arm a band of iron around her waist, claiming her, protecting her. The curse was not just broken, it was shattered. The summer that followed was a hard, bright, breathless thing. The high plains, which had been a world of wind and ice, became a world of relentless sun and dust. The victory in town had been absolute, but it had not been magical. They had the land, both pieces, Elias's high claim in the foothills, and Silas's the richer, darker, disputed land down by the river. It was this second piece, his land, that Clara felt drawn to. It was scarred, just as she was. The syndicate, in their arrogance, had not worked it, only held it. The small cabin Silas had started to build was just a ruin of rotted logs. The earth was choked with sagebrush and thistle. They worked it together. It was a new kind underscore of partnership, forged not in the desperation of a blizzard, but in the shared labor of a Wyoming summer. Elias would ride out from their cabin before dawn, the bay's hooves stirring the cool, silver dust. Clara would follow an hour later on the mare, the children riding with her. They would leave the cabin in the hills, their fortress, and descend to the riverland, their future. The work was brutal. It was not the gentle planting she had done in the cabin garden. This was breaking new sod. Elias, his shoulders and back a solid wall of straining muscle, guided the single plow, its blade screaming as it tore through the matted roots of the prairie. Clara followed behind him, her hands, which had just begun to heal, now blistered and raw again. She broke up the clods of earth with a heavy hoe, her shawl soaked with sweat, her hair plastered to her face. They were trying to get a late crop of potatoes and beans in, something, anything, for the winter. Money was tighter than it had ever been. Elias's wages from the Bar Z stopped. He was a landowner now, not a ranch hand, and he was the man who had brought down the syndicate. No other ranch would hire him. They lived on what was left of his savings, on the 2 hens, on the fish Elias caught in the river, and on the flour he bought with the last of his coin. But it was theirs. The townsfolk, when they rode in for supplies, treated them with a strange, new distance. It was not the contempt of before. It was a wary, stunned respect. They were not the cursed widow and the scarred brute anymore. They were the Vaughn family, the woman who had shot a man to save her husband, and the man who had faced down the syndicate. They were left alone, but in a different way. It was no longer shunning. It was respect. The land was slow to yield. The sun baked the ground. The river was their only salvation. Elias and Clara hauled buckets of water, their arms aching, to keep the small, hopeful green sprouts alive. Henry, quiet and serious, took on the task of pulling weeds. Ruthie, too small to haul, hunted for grasshoppers, crushing them under her bare, tough feet. They were a family, etched in sweat and dirt. But the riverland was not home. Not yet. It held too many ghosts. The bluff where Silas had died was always visible, a stark, pale cut in the earth, a mile distant. Clara would find herself staring at it, the hoe still in her hand, until Elias's voice, low and steady, would pull her back. "Clara, the water!" And she would turn back to the living. The true home was the cabin in the foothills. That was where they returned each night, exhausted, caked in mud, to the safety of the pines. And it was that home that Elias began to change. One morning, instead of riding to the river, he took his axe and went into the trees. Clara watched him. He was not chopping firewood. He was measuring, his long strides purposeful. He was sighting along the logs, picking the straightest, strongest pines. For a week, the clearing rang with the sound of his axe. It was a clean, sharp, vital sound. He was felling trees, notching them, dragging them back to the cabin with the mare. He was building. He was adding a new room. It was a lean-to, built against the cabin's east wall, but it was built with a care that bordered on reverence. He cut a new doorway through the cabin's solid log wall, his saw biting deep. He laid a new plank floor, the wood so fresh it smelled of sharp, sweet resin. Clara knew what it was for. It was a room for the children. It was a statement, more powerful than any kiss, more binding than any vow. He was turning his hermit's refuge, his solitary hole, into a family home. He was making space. He was planning for a future that included all of them. While he built the walls, Clara made the room a home. She had no money for fabric, so she took their empty flour sacks, washed them until they were soft and white, and sewed them together. She hemmed them with thread she pulled from a ruined dress. She made 2 small, neat curtains for the room's single, small window. She stuffed new mattresses with fresh, dry grass. When it was done, they moved the children's cot into the new room. Henry and Ruthie, who had spent their lives crammed into corners. A shack, a single cabin room, were speechless. They had their own space, their own door, their own window. That night, for the first time, Clara and Elias were truly alone. The cabin was quiet, full of a new, adult warmth. The small pallet on the floor felt, for the first time, like a bed. But the ghost did not vanish just because they had new walls. They were still there, shadows in the corners, living beside the new warmth. Clara carried the weight of the gunshot. She would wake up in the dark, her heart hammering, the smell of burnt powder in her nose. She would see Hatcher's face, the look of stupid, terrible surprise as her bullet struck him. She had taken a life. On those nights, Elias would wake with her. He would not speak. He would just hold her, his hand on the back of her head, his calloused palm a steady, grounding weight. He knew the cost of killing. He knew the price of survival. He had been a soldier. He just held her until the shaking stopped, until her breathing evened out, and she fell back asleep. And Elias carried his own grief. It was quieter now, not the hollow, cold emptiness that had driven him north. But it was there. Sometimes he would be watching Henry try to whittle a stick, his small face a mask of concentration, and a look of such profound sadness would cross Elias's face that Clara would have to turn away. He was seeing the ghost of his own son, Daniel. He was a man caught between two lives, one dead, one just beginning. He was a father to two children, but his own blood was in the ground in Texas. Clara, in turn, learned to give him his space. She would not question him when he would walk away from the cabin at dusk, standing on the ridge for an hour, just looking west. She knew he was talking to his ghosts, to Maria, to the boy. She knew he was making his peace. They were two broken people, walking side by side, carrying their burdens together. The weight was still heavy, but it was shared, and that made it bearable. The summer wore on, hot and long. One afternoon, the air was still, the heat a heavy woolen blanket. Elias was on the porch, reseating a loose axe head. Clara was inside, mending Henry's only shirt. The children were supposed to be napping in their new room, but Ruthie, as always, was too full of life to be still. She slipped out of the cabin, her bare feet silent on the pine needles. She went to the clearing, where a patch of stubborn, bright wildflowers grew in the thin, rocky soil. There were bluebells and yellow clusters of arnica, and a few stalks of deep red Indian paintbrush. She picked a small, clumsy handful. She came back into the cabin. It was dark and cool inside. She saw her mother, sewing by the faint light. She saw the mantel, the one just high enough for her to reach if she stood on her toes. On it sat the small, carved wooden box, Clara's box. It was open. It was always open now. Inside, two things rested side by side on the dark velvet lining. One was her mother's old, worn, gold wedding ring. Clara had put it there the day Elias had kissed her in the rain. The other was a small, octagonal piece of silver-colored metal, stamped with a name and a regiment. It was Elias's identification tag from the war. Clara had found it in his saddlebag when she was mending it, along with a faded, cracked tintype of a woman with dark hair and a baby. She had left the picture, but the tag, the piece of him that had seen so much death, she had taken. She had put it in the box, next to her ring. Their pasts, their griefs, lay to rest together. Ruthie, in her 5-year-old wisdom, saw none of that. She saw two pretty, shiny things, and she saw a box that was a perfect vase. She stood on her toes, reached up, and gently, one by one, laid her wildflowers in the box. She put a bluebell on the ring. She laid the red paintbrush across the metal tag. She filled the box with the bright, living colors of the high plains summer. Clara had stopped sewing. Elias had stopped working. They both watched, silent. Ruthie, satisfied with her work, turned and beamed at her mother. Then she ran back to her room. Clara and Elias looked at each other. They did not speak. They did not have to. They looked at the box, Their pasts, their ghosts, were still there, but they were covered in flowers. They were covered by the present, by life. That night, the children were asleep. The summer heat had finally broken, and a cool, clean breeze came down from the mountains. They sat on the porch, side by side on the top step. The sky was a vast, deep, cloudless purple, punctured by a million stars. Elias was quiet for a long time, rolling a cigarette, a rare luxury. He lit it, the small flare of the match briefly illuminating his scarred, calm face.
Clara,
He said, his voice low.
I'm here.
He took a long draw from the cigarette, the ember glowing red. That man in town, the marshal, Albright, he said you had your name back, Miller. Clara was still. She knew this was not an idle observation. I was wondering, he said, staring out into the darkness, if you would ever want a new one. He turned to look at her. His eyes were clear, steady. Not because you were in an alley, not because you were cold, not because you needed saving, but by choice. I was wondering if you would take mine. Clara looked at his strong, rough hand, resting on his knee. She looked at his face, the face that had been a terrifying shadow and was now the truest thing she knew. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes. They were not tears of grief. They were not tears of fear. They were tears of pure, simple release. She nodded, unable to speak. She put her hand over his. The tears fell, hot on their joined hands. She finally found her voice, a whisper in the vast, quiet night. I already did, she said, her voice thick. I already did, the night you said I could come home. The summer gave way to a hard, bright autumn. They harvested their meager crops from the river land. It was not much, a few bushels of potatoes, a sack of hard beans, but it was theirs. They had enough. Winter came again. It came hard and fast, as it always does in Wyoming. The high plains were buried in a deep, clean white. The wind returned, keening around the corners of the cabin. But this time, everything was different. The cabin was warm. The new room was tight and secure. The woodpile, stacked high from their summer's work, was a fortress of fuel. The small larder was not full, but it was not empty. One night, the first heavy snow of the deep winter was falling. The children were long asleep in their own room, safe. Elias and Clara sat by the pot-bellied stove, the fire crackling, casting a dancing orange light on the walls. She was mending a blanket. He was reading a week-old newspaper he had gotten in town. It was a scene of such impossible, ordinary peace that it made Clara's heart ache. She looked at him, at the way the firelight caught his scar, at the set of his jaw as he read. She put the blanket down. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against the warm wool of his back. He reached up, covering her hands with his own. We ain't cursed, are we, Elias? She whispered, the last old, cold fear rising in her throat. Elias was still for a moment. He set the paper down. He turned in the chair, pulling her around onto his lap. He held her, his arms strong, and looked into her eyes. He smiled, the faint, rare smile that was hers alone. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, his rough fingers gentle. No, he said, his voice low and sure. We're just alive. The fire crackles. Outside, the snow fell thick and silent, covering the land. But this time, it was not an enemy. It was not a shroud. It was a blanket. It was peace. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.